For most of human history, we've told ourselves a simple, brutal story about the ancient past, that it was a world of pure survival of the fittest. That anyone born different, anyone injured badly enough to slow down, was left behind, cast out, or quietly erased by a world with no room for weakness. The bones say otherwise. Buried in caves, in burial mounds, in the quiet sediment of archaeological sites around the world, researchers keep finding the same defiant evidence. Skeletons of people who lived for years, sometimes decades, with disabilities that should have made survival impossible on their own. People who couldn't walk. People who couldn't chew. People who couldn't hunt, farm, or fight. And yet, they lived. Someone made sure of it. This is the story of disability and injury in the ancient world, and the surprising, deeply human truth buried underneath it. In Vietnam, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a young man who lived roughly 4,000 years ago. His skeleton tells a stark story, a degenerative condition likely present from adolescence, that left him paralyzed from the waist down for at least a decade before he died. He couldn't have hunted. He couldn't have farmed. By any purely transactional measure of survival, he was a liability to his community. He lived anyway, cared for, fed, kept alive. For 10 years after paralysis set in a farming community with no wheelchairs, no modern medicine, no social safety net beyond the people around him, he is far from alone. In France, the skeleton known as Romito II, a young man from roughly 10,000 years ago, shows a severe form of dwarfism that would have made him almost entirely dependent on others for basic survival. He was buried with care, alongside a fully grown adult, in a shared grave that suggests he was valued, mourned, and remembered as part of the group, not discarded as a burden. And then there's Shanada I, the Neanderthal skeleton found in Iraq, whose injuries we've touched on before: a crushed eye socket that likely left him blind on one side, a withered and possibly amputated forearm, and a pronounced limp from a poorly healed leg injury. Some researchers believe he may have also had partial hearing loss. He was, by the standards of his environment, profoundly disabled, and he lived for years. Some estimates suggest well over a decade. After those injuries first occurred, these aren't isolated flukes. They're a pattern, and that pattern forces a hard rewrite of the story we thought we knew. Here's the uncomfortable math. A person who cannot walk cannot forage. A person who cannot chew solid food needs it prepared differently, perhaps softened or processed by someone else. A person with a severe injury needs protection from predators, from the elements, from rival groups, all without being able to contribute in the ways their community depended on for survival. None of that happens by accident. Every one of these skeletons represents a sustained, ongoing decision, made collectively, over months and years. We will not let this person die just because they can no longer do what they used to do. Anthropologists have a term for the threshold of care visible in cases like these. The point of injury or impairment so severe that survival is, by definition, proof of communal support. It's sometimes called the rule of thumb for survival, and Shanada I is one of the textbook cases used to illustrate a level of injury so severe that the individual could not possibly have survived through self-sufficiency alone. This changes the picture of prehistoric life dramatically. We tend to imagine small hunter-gatherer bands as ruthlessly practical, unable to afford dead weight. And there is truth to the constraints they lived under. Resources were often scarce, mobility mattered, and life was undeniably hard. But hard doesn't mean heartless. Across tens of thousands of years, and across cultures with zero contact with one another, the same instinct shows up again and again in the archaeological record. Care for the injured and disabled wasn't the exception. It was expected. It would be a mistake, though, to tell this story only as one of charity, of the able-bodied generously carrying the disabled. The evidence suggests something more complex, and in some ways more interesting. Disabled and differently abled individuals in many ancient societies held real roles, real value, and real status. Consider the archaeological evidence of individuals with limb differences or restricted mobility found buried with tools associated with specialized crafts, toolmaking, weaving, or ornament production. work that required fine motor skill and patience rather than raw physical strength or mobility. In agricultural and settled societies especially, there was more room for a person to contribute meaningfully without needing to run, lift, or fight. There's also compelling evidence, particularly in societies that left behind spiritual or religious traditions, that individuals with visible differences, including physical disabilities, were sometimes given special status specifically because they were different. Shamans and spiritual leaders in numerous documented cultures were disproportionately drawn from people who stood apart physically, those with visual impairments, seizure disorders, unusual births, or significant injuries. Their difference wasn't hidden or apologized for. It was interpreted as a sign, evidence of a connection to something beyond the ordinary, a mark that set them aside for a different kind of role in the community. This doesn't mean ancient life for disabled individuals was easy, or that every society treated disability with equal grace. Undoubtedly, some communities, under extreme resource pressure, made brutal choices that left little trace in the archaeological record. The very young, the very old, and the severely injured are exactly the individuals least likely to survive in times of famine or crisis, regardless of how their community felt about them. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of universal compassion, but the evidence we do have consistently pushes back against the idea that disability automatically meant abandonment. Ancient humans didn't just care for the injured passively. They adapted the world around them and adapted themselves in ways that echo modern assistive technology far more than we tend to assume. Archaeologists have found evidence of prosthetics stretching back thousands of years. In ancient Egypt, a wooden and leather prosthetic toe, found attached to a mummified woman, dated to roughly 1000 BCE, shows clear signs of wear consistent with actual use in walking, not just symbolic burial decoration. It was carefully carved, hinged, and refitted multiple times over its owner's life to accommodate healing and changes in her foot. That's not a ritual object. That's a well-used, functional medical device. In ancient Rome, there is documented use of a bronze prosthetic leg, discovered in a burial dating back over 2,000 years, fitted to someone who had lost a limb, likely below the knee, and continued to live an active life afterward. Written Roman sources even reference soldiers who lost limbs in battle and returned to civilian life fitted with prosthetic replacements. Beyond prosthetics, there's evidence of environmental adaptation. Dwellings modified for individuals with restricted mobility, positioned closer to communal gathering areas rather than requiring long, difficult travel. There's evidence of specialized diets for those who could no longer chew solid food, with softened or pre-processed grains found associated with the burial sites of elderly or injured individuals who had lost most of their teeth. None of this required a word for disability rights. It required something much simpler and, in some ways, much harder to fake sustained attention. Over years, from people willing to keep adjusting their world to fit the person in front of them rather than the other way around. The phrase, survival of the fittest, gets misapplied constantly, including, ironically, to a history it doesn't actually describe. In evolutionary biology, fitness doesn't mean strength, speed, or physical perfection. It means the ability to survive and reproduce successfully within a given environment. And for a highly social species like ours, one of the single biggest advantages an environment can offer is a group willing to protect its most vulnerable members. Cooperation, care, and the willingness to invest in individuals who couldn't immediately earn their keep through physical labor may well have been one of our species' core competitive advantages. Not a weakness we tolerated despite evolutionary pressure, but a strategy that helped us outlast other hominin species entirely. A group that abandons every injured or disabled member loses accumulated knowledge, skill, and social bonds every single time misfortune strikes. A group that invests in keeping people alive and integrated, holds onto experience, memory, and relationships that a purely disposable approach to injury would throw away. Shanada One's crushed skull and shortened leg represent decades of accumulated tool-making knowledge, hunting experience, and social relationships that his community chose to preserve rather than lose when he could no longer contribute in the same physical ways he once had. That's not sentiment overriding survival instinct. In a very real sense, it was the survival instinct playing out over a longer time horizon than we often give ancient humans credit for. What makes this evidence so compelling isn't any single skeleton. It's how widely the pattern repeats across regions and time periods that had no way of influencing one another. In Germany, a Neanderthal skeleton found at La Chapelle, Ox Saints, an elderly individual, likely in his 40s or 50s, ancient by Neanderthal standards, shows severe arthritis, extensive tooth loss, and evidence of multiple healed injuries. His condition would have made hunting, and possibly even eating solid food, extremely difficult in his final years, and yet the evidence points to him surviving well past the point his body alone could have sustained him. In North America, skeletal remains from various pre-contact indigenous sites show individuals who survived severe childhood illnesses that left lasting physical impairments. Cases of healed but deforming bone infections, for instance, that would have affected mobility for life. Grave goods buried alongside these individuals, when present, are frequently comparable to those of able-bodied community members, suggesting no reduction in social status or communal regard. In the ancient Near East, textual evidence eventually catches up to what the bones had already been suggesting for millennia. Mesopotamian legal codes include specific provisions relating to the care and rights of individuals with physical and cognitive impairments. Early evidence that disability wasn't simply a private family matter, but something societies felt compelled to formally address, protect, and regulate. Even burial practices themselves tell a story. Archaeologists pay close attention not just to whether someone with a disability was buried, but how. Position, orientation, grave goods, and placement relative to other graves all carry meaning. Time and again, individuals with significant physical differences are found buried with the same care, the same ritual attention, and often the same or comparable possessions as everyone else around them. A quiet, physical rebuttal to the idea that they were considered lesser members of their communities. None of this erases the harder truths. Resource scarcity was real. Famine, conflict, and brutal environmental pressure sometimes forced choices no modern observer would envy making. Not every ancient society treated disability identically, and we should resist flattening enormous cultural and temporal diversity into a single, uncomplicated story of universal compassion. But taken together, the pattern across continents, cultures, and tens of thousands of years of separation is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. It looks, instead, like something closer to a shared thread running through the human story itself. We will never know Shanidar One's name. We will never know what the young paralyzed farmer in ancient Vietnam dreamed about during the 10 years his community carried him. We will never hear the voice of the small, fragile young man buried with such evident care in the caves of Romito. But we have their bones, and their bones tell us something that no myth about brutal, indifferent prehistory ever could, that long before written history, before religion codified compassion into commandments, before anyone wrote a single word about human rights, people were already choosing, again and again, to care for those among them who could no longer care for themselves. Disability in the ancient world wasn't a death sentence. It was, again and again, met with adaptation, ingenuity, and an instinct for care every bit as old as pain itself.